Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well.
Everyone's doing
well. Okay, thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you for the invitation.
Sure. So let's go ahead and get started. I probably don't have to belabor the idea that we're in a divisive America and a divisive culture in general, divisive everything. What I would like to address, though, is how this has been brought into our church and divided brothers and sisters in Christ. So, George, maybe you could start with answering how you think this came about.
Well, first of all, it's not a new phenomenon. We, the plural we, the quotation marks we, have always been divided on many issues, from civil rights to ordination to gifting to liturgy to worship to everything else. Politics is no different than that. I do remember growing up in a church a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, where in the physical building of the church, it had a middle aisle separating the two sets of pews. People would sit on one or the other side right around election time. And part of the reason that I would suggest is because we haven't defined the we. Who actually is the we? When we think of Christians, in general, the capital C Christians, quite often we confuse adjectives and nouns, and we'll stay with the US or America or North America. When we say American Christian, quite often the American functions as a noun and the Christian functions as an adjective. I'm an American who happens to be a Christian. In the long history of Christianity, it's the other way around. I'm a Christian who happens to be born, raised, live, reside in Canada or the US or wherever else. So why are we here? Because we're here because we're confusing nouns and adjectives. The set identity, the core identity, is not Christian. The core identity is something else. And therefore, when those identities collide, we separate.
Very interesting. Yeah, that seems sad that we don't have our core set in our minds. Jake, what are some of your thoughts on this?
So to kind of build off of that, the things that make a people are commonly held things that they love together, or some common aspiration they have as a community. And I think one of the things that's very difficult right now in the US is that so much of the way we go about our daily lives, the way we regard our own identities, is pushed very hard into you are this free, detached, autonomous individual, and you will write your story, you will shape your identity. And anything that would threaten your freedom to do that is actually regarded as an injustice, as dangerous. And yet often those things that inhibit our choices are the things that will give us a sense of identity, a sense of shared membership with other people. There's a old line that Wendell Berry has in one of his essays: the impeded stream is the one that sings. And so we often think about identity in America, and I think you can even see it very clearly in a lot of our art. You think about like a movie like Dead Poets Society is a little dated example, but everyone has their own walk, and everyone create your own way of striding through the courtyard. That's actually a very isolating and alienating way of thinking about your identity, your personhood as it relates to that of other people. And so we live in a society that's fairly isolating in its kind of assumptions about the good life, and then that doesn't even get into all the material factors that will drive this. The distances that we live from people, the amount of time we spend working, the amount of time we need to spend working to make ends meet, all of these things contribute to that sense of isolation and fragility, which makes it very hard to form thick bonds of friendship.
Absolutely, I agree with you. Kaitlyn, the political parties, both sides, I'm not taking either side here. They both seem to have their pros and their cons. And the con, of course, is that whichever platform it is, they kind of take something away from Christians, I guess I would say. One side wants you to kind of privatize your Christianity. The other side just wants to subjugate your theology, so this becomes part of their platform. So either way, that's not good for the Christian. So how do we as Christians, and I'll define the we as all Christians that are, never mind, I take that back. I'm not going to define Christians, but we as Christians, how do we fight against that type of pull on our faith?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it comes down to what's already been said about our primary identity and community being in the people of God, and rooting us in what it means to engage the world from that position and not from an individual position, or not from one in which our chosen community is a political party or a politician. The other thing that I would say is that a lot of times what we have done is taken particularly one vote, the presidential vote, and made it need to carry everything that we care about, everything that we are. And then hopefully, if we're being faithful, that means everything that God cares about. And so, my vote has to represent my community and me and everything that I care about. And of course, when we try and do that, it becomes fraught to the point of just impossibility. And so what I'm doing, with the people in my community and the local church that I work at, and the people in my seminary, is trying and encouraging us to say, how can we be creative and strategic in the way that we engage, so that we recognize that some votes will represent certain things that we care about. Maybe other votes down the ballot can represent other things that we care about. And maybe if we get in a position where we're trying to think through, for example, the presidential vote that is so fraught, if the vote that we make can't represent everything that we care about, and as you said, it absolutely cannot, how are we then seeking those good things in our community through our own service, through the way that our church engages, through the way that we do all sorts of other means of advocating politically? And so if, someone in my church recently came up to me and said, I've decided who I'm voting for president, and I hate that it can't represent my desire to see abortions lessened in this country. And I said, that's amazing. There's a crisis pregnancy center down the street that is materially impacting vulnerable people in our community, providing them with resources. It's run by a woman who lives in that community and knows, their needs. How can you support them? And then also maybe there are votes, throughout the ballot because a certain issue is really important in your local community at this particular moment. And instead of feeling wedded to one unchanging position on a party, instead being wedded to some pretty strong positions on maybe specific policies, but even then holding some of those things loosely enough to say, I know my community, especially those most local to me who I can have relationships with. I know them well enough to actually engage faithfully in these votes, instead of being kind of caught up in national debates that are important, and we should be faithful and wise in the way we engage. And yet those tend to capture our attention in a way that draws our affections, that demands our loyalty in a way that sometimes more local engagement doesn't. It can still do that, but how could we really be just present enough in our communities that we can engage in politics at that level, that then hopefully trickles up to things that we care about, more nationally. But when we start there, it's so abstracted away from real human needs that of course it's going to become a measure of, the party that I support becomes part of my identity, or the community that I relate to, in a really abstract way that doesn't really represent, I think, the really incredible power that a lot of us, especially from the base of our churches, an institution, a community that can then, really do something significant in our communities that isn't defined by either kind of allowing our theology to be subjugated or privatizing it.
Right. Yeah, community is definitely key. I think that, that's slowly been slipping away from everyone. And then with COVID, even more. So I think community is very important to focus on. George, maybe you have some thoughts on how we deal with this in our churches or in our faith.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, multiple ways, as Kaitlyn said. First of all, and we can start going down the list. First of all, recognizing that the church, the body, the ecclesia, is a political reality, right? It is not that we enter somebody else's field called party politics, not being political, in that the very fact that we gather together as a people of God, baptized, new family, cross borders, transnational, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's a political statement. At its core, its foundation, its base, it's a political statement. Everything the church does is political. It may not be party politics, but it is actually the action of citizens, of people of a kingdom, and that is a kingdom of God. And quite often we forget the political character of even the liturgy of the church, right? When we come to that great moment in confession, right, at the Eucharist, and we say, the peace of Christ be with you. That's not a pious statement. That is a political statement, right? You are not my enemy. I am not your enemy. God's peace be with you, right? That is actually political. That then extends itself to our local communities, how we behave with one another, how do we address racism and sexism and economic disparities and everything else in the quote system, end quote, that affects lives, especially the lives of people. One of the surveys that came out this week, I don't remember exactly what day of the week it was. It was on by Lifeway surveys, it's a Christian survey, asked evangelicals of how will you vote, not party, but what is your primary concern? And combined 41 and 20, about 61% of the vote was people who think like me and act for my benefit. People who think and act for the benefit of those who are less fortunate or underprivileged in my community was 17%. So can you imagine that? That we look at the world, as Christians, we look at the world outside of us, with us at the center instead of them, whoever the them is at the center. So that's where addressing local issues, then more broadly, more broader community issues, then national, then transnational issues. These are not either or conditions, these are both and conditions. And not only are they both and, they are stemming from the baptism and Eucharist in which we participate as a community, regardless of what you call it, whether you call it sacraments or ordinances or whatever one calls it, it doesn't actually matter. What matters is that these are the acts of citizens who claim God's presence in this reality.
Wow, I think when you say local, with some of the stats you mentioned, I think local means that a lot of Christians need to start by working on themselves, right? Maybe reading the Word and praying a little bit more so that they look outwardly and present themselves outwardly in the community in a way that's God's kingdom. Yeah. That's a wonderful point. Jake, so a similar question, I guess. As Christians, then where do we fit in this whole political horizon, and how do we present ourselves as faithful Christians in a political world, and obviously being political creatures?
Yeah. So I guess the story that came to mind as I was listening to what everyone else was saying, I remember a few years ago talking to a pastor friend who was in like year 3 or 4 at this church. It was the second church he'd been in. It was 3rd or 4th year. And that's often when things kind of get a little rocky for new pastors, because the honeymoon's definitely over by then. And the congregation is becoming aware that you're different than your predecessor, and that's creating issues. And so he had this congregant asking him, what's our church's plan for fighting poverty? And my friend was like, well, are you in relationship with the poor? Are they in your home? And the congregant just kind of looked at him blankly. And like, Mike was like, well, that's my plan, is that we would be in relationship with these people. So there's almost a sense in which like the voting question is an important one, but I think the duty most proper to citizens in a republic is responsible stewardship of the power and influence we've been given in our local place. Voting in national elections is important, but there's all these downstream things, as others have been saying, that are more accessible to us. And in many ways will exert greater local influence anyway. And so I think the way I would want to frame it is, I think there are defensible reasons for being a Republican. There are defensible reasons for being a Democrat. There are defensible reasons for being third party. And I think if we identify with one of those parties for good reasons, then I don't think that needs to be a cause for division. I think the place where Christians map most importantly, though, isn't on the kind of partisan lines, but it is in the shape of your action, your neighborliness in the place that God's called you to, the way that you do or don't make yourself available to the people that God has set right in front of you. Those are the more, I think, kind of rubber meets the road questions. I think when we start getting into the partisan stuff, it's so broken at this point that I can very easily sympathize with somebody that goes any route in this election. There are bad ways of getting to Republican or Democrat or third party, of course, as well. But I think that's, in a lot of ways, become a bit of a red herring that, as Kaitlyn said, also is kind of a distraction from the work that we're actually able to do that has more concrete expression than a lot of what we end up doing in a voting box in November. It's a little rambly, but that's my thought.
No, not at all.
That's where I would push a little bit, agreeing with you that I may vote for the Republican or the Democrat or another party, but I'm not a Republican or a Democrat. I'm a Christian. And therefore, my identity is not in the party politic, but it is in the politic of Jesus, and working out of that. When we calcify our way of thinking but I have been a Democrat or I have been a Republican all my life, actually we do surrender to others with different plan and strategies and hope for outcomes, the political life. And that comes with consequence.
You're saying when we kind of foreground the partisan identity?
Right.
That's right. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
Food for thought. I think we're getting to final statements, and I want to hear from all of y'all. But maybe we could start with Kaitlyn. You could tell us what you'd like to leave the audience with.
Yeah, one thing that's been really helpful and for me in having conversations with people in my community, and something that I've been kind of having as my soapbox recently, is just that I think one of the greatest gifts that Christians give the world, the whole world of believers and non-believers, when it comes to politics, is the fact that we are resurrection people and that we are not swayed by existential threats to our physical lives, to our livelihood, that when we engage in politics, we have the freedom to do it without the kind of pragmatism that often constrains people who this is the end, the power that they have, the wealth that they have, their physical life, like that is the end of the line. And that I'm biased because the group of women that I lead have been going through Luke and Acts, and we've been talking a lot about how so much of the conflict that happens in Luke's telling of the story is between people for whom political power and privilege and wealth is the end of the line. And so the really politically radical thing that Jesus brings is not in kind of overthrowing a system or in creating a new people that operate the same way the world understands a people to work, but in creating a people for himself that aren't constrained by those kinds of logics. And so even the questions that get asked and the stories that get told are going to be surprising to a world that is constrained by that kind of pragmatism. And both sides do this really, really well. Even more recently, I was talking to a friend who pointed out that even just the abortion debate becomes existential for both sides. That's a huge rallying tool, is saying this is the end of all abortions and that's a good thing, or it's the worst thing ever. This person becomes president and that's the end of life as we know it. And the really heartbreaking thing for me in my city that is filled with lots of Christians, I'm in Dallas, is that we're so constrained by that kind of thinking as well, that this is the end of our livelihood. If someone becomes president that doesn't like Christians, then somehow that means our faith is ended. And I want us to fight faithfully for things that include religious liberty in a country that has promised that. But I want us to fight for it because we're seeking the good of our entire community, especially with the vulnerable and marginalized in mind, and that we're doing it from a place of knowing that nothing can ultimately be taken from us that is of ultimate eternal worth, that is secure for us, and that we could lose all sorts of fights, we could lose all sorts of rights, and we would be, eternally secure in the hope that we have in Christ. And that if that's one of the primary gifts that we give the watching world, then a failure to do that is not just a failure to engage in politics well, it's a failure to witness to the gospel effectively.
Absolutely, I agree. I think I agree with George, because I think you're kind of building on the same statement. Is we have to walk out first as members of a kingdom to show that we're different. If we just fight about the issues, then there's really no difference between us and the rest of the world. So, Jake?
So much that we could say. So I guess the thing I would want to go to is to say, we don't need to be afraid. And I think for a lot of our neighbors, fear is actually a very natural and even reasonable posture to take. Because if you think about the way that a lot of our peers see the human person and see identity, your identity is so incredibly fragile that there is a real sense in which politics is a threat to that, neighbors can be a threat to that, employers of certain types can be a threat to that, because you have this onus on yourself to make something of yourself, to narrate your identity. If you're a Christian, you are not your own, you belong to God. That's the move Alan Noble is going to make in his book that I'm really excited to read when it comes out. But that also means that you're not your own, you are your family's in a sense, and you are part of your church. You're part of your neighborhood. For a Christian, human beings are made as relational, political creatures. And so being in relationship with neighbors or with a spouse or with extended family or with a church, these things don't need to be fearful. They're actually very natural and good. And so you can approach those kind of communities not from a posture of fear and how is this going to hinder me in the expression of my own freedom, but you can actually approach it from a position of kind of quiet confidence that God gives us to one another so that we can serve and delight each other. We can together enjoy the world that he's made. And hopefully that will change the kind of posture that we take into common life, not simply in politics, but in everything we do as citizens of a republic, as neighbors, as family members, as church members, and so on.
Wonderful. Well, George, I am going to give you the last word.
Always dangerous. A book that has been coming back again and again and again as a very important book to my mind is Stanley Hauerwas's 40-year-old book by now, Community of Character, which it continues to be so fresh and so right on what it actually means to be the people of God. For me, the last words of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew actually sum up what is happening. We usually call it the Great Commission, and we start with go and make disciples. But if one opens the scriptures and reads it, it begins with a therefore, which means it's a dependent clause. It's a secondary clause, right? The actual quote that Matthew puts in the lips of Jesus is, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Therefore, right? And we forget that first part. All authority in heaven and on earth, regardless of what others claim, whether in heaven or on earth, is mine. I am making all things new. This is my creation, recreation, resurrection, new life. Go and preach that. Go and make a new community out of a new baptism and behave in the way that I have taught you. Quite often we titrate the gospel down to my soul going to heaven, which is a Gnostic gospel, not a Christian gospel. And we forget that second part, which is not just the baptized, but teaching them to behave, to act, to work out in the manner that I have taught you. In other words, Christians are distinctively different than other people. James K. Smith, in his book, Who's Afraid of Postmodernism, has a phrase, he says, which is, a transition out of Hauerwas, it says, the church doesn't have an apologetic. The church is an apologetic. And quite often we forget that we are God's apologetic to the world of what peace and reconciliation and life and resurrection and hope and abundance looks like. And therefore, because we have forgotten those, we have forgotten who is in charge and who has authority in the world, we live in fear and scarcity, and we're easily loyal to other lords than Jesus.
Absolutely. Well, guys, thank you all so much for taking the time to share all of your thoughts, and deliberations are very thoughtful and appreciated.